Well, good morning. As Clay said earlier, my name is John Long. I'm the pastor of Technical Arts, which is basically the media that you see, the sound that you hear. I kind of oversee all that. So this morning I'm actually doing two jobs. I'm doing that and this. So, first of all, do you see me up there? That's very important for me keeping my job. It's good. And another thing is now I don't want you have to worry about where you look. So, you don't have to look straight at me. You can look at either one of those two screens, and that's going to be just fine for me. Because if you look there, that means I'm doing my job well, and that's okay. So don't worry about looking at me. I'm just going to look at the side of your heads as you guys look up there. Well, about 20 years ago, I actually attended my first funeral. And it was my grandfather, and he was really important to all of us. In fact, he was so important that I got a call at like 1 o'clock in the morning, and I lived in Washington, D.C., and he lived in Ohio, and I was there the very next day. In fact, everyone in our family was there the very next day. There was no delay in getting there because he was the most important part of our family. He was the anchor of our family. My grandfather loved us, and he loved us in a way that just touched each one of us differently. I sat there, I remember distinctly standing in my mother's kitchen, and all 6 of his kids were there and their spouses, and my 12 or 11 cousins were there. And we were all standing there telling stories about Grandpa and just laughing. And, it was a really sad time and mournful. We were like really sad, but it was great. It was such a fun time. We were all together and we were all telling these great stories. We were all laughing and talking about him and just remembering him. And it was just great. And what I found out, which I kind of knew but didn't know for sure, was that my grandfather had an impact on each one of my cousins, just like he did on me. See, actually, I thought I was a favorite because he always did all this great stuff with me, and he had such an impact on my life. I mean, we used to go fishing all the time together. He'd take my brother and I, just the two of us, camping for like 3 days, and we'd go fishing and hiking and all that stuff. We'd go to Carter's Lumber, which was the lumber company, and we'd go and buy lumber together because he rebuilt houses and remodeled. And I would always go and help him, He would have me, hey, come and help me remodel. I said, oh, okay, and I'd go. I didn't do anything except sweep up after he was all done. But it was great just to be there, hang out with Grandpa. And he touched each of us like that. He built relationships within us because of his relationship with us. And the reason why was because family really mattered to him. It mattered a lot. It mattered so much that nothing would break up that family idea. In fact, if we ever did anything that kind of messed that up, if we had something that hurt someone else in the family, or we did something that would kind of hurt a relationship, my grandfather was right there. Now, my grandmother may have sent him, but it didn't matter because it was his face that we looked at, and he was the one who said, you need to fix that. This is not right. You need to go to that person, and you need to take care of that. You two don't need to be acting like that. The unity of this family is more important than whatever your problem is, or whatever your individual need is, or whatever selfish reason you have for this is. He took care of that, and he made sure that we took care of it too. Family was so important to my grandfather that he instituted a family picnic. So a few years before he died, he decided that we needed to get together. A lot of us were taking off and leaving town. So we all grew up together. It was myself and all my cousins except 2 lived in the same hometown. So we hung out together all the time. I mean, my cousin Tim and I, we used to go fishing all the time down at the river, just hang out for like hours and just spend time together and love each other. And are you shaking your head? You know my cousin Tim. He's a great guy. He's single too. We used to hang out so much that it was like there was like nothing it was like my own brother. My cousin Rusty and I would hang out, Chip, Bunny, long story. And anyway, we all hung out together so much that it was like this, it was special. It was really special because we didn't have to worry about how we acted. We didn't have to worry about what we said. We didn't have to worry about what we did. We were family. We were close. We were connected. We had unconditional love for each other. It didn't matter what we did because we mattered to each other. And what mattered to us was that everybody else mattered. That was what was important. So my grandfather has this family picnic instituted so that we never forget that. He did it so that once a year we would come together as a family so that we would never forget what our family meant to us and what that was like. And in fact, it started out as it was just one day. It was like a Saturday in August. But what it turned out to be was we'd all take vacation and be there all week. So everyone who moved out of town would come into town, and we'd hang out all week. It was just like growing up. The only difference was we didn't have jobs or school, so it was even more fun. And we would go do stuff all the time together, that whole week together, and then it would all culminate on that one Saturday where we all got together and we hung out and we had this family picnic. I mean, it's just so awesome. And it still happens today. In the morning, my grandmother and my Aunt Sandy and my Aunt Torch, another story, would get together and cook breakfast, and we'd all go there early in the morning, like 6:30, and spend the whole day there. We'd be there all day long. We would hang out together and do different things together, and we'd always play softball. And my grandfather was the pitcher. He always pitched all the time. He never batted. He just pitched, all the time for both teams. And still to this day, that still happens. That family picnic still happens. We stay till dark, and then it's like, can't even see where you're going, and people are grabbing stuff and cleaning up and going, taking everything back. The family picnic was important because what it did was it reminded us how important our family was, how important the unity of our family was. And my grandfather was very wise in starting this picnic because he never wanted us to forget that. And 20 years later, that picnic still happens today. Now, my grandfather had 12 grandkids, but now he has 20 great-grandchildren. It's expanded, and we invite everybody there. So it's not just our family, it's anybody. And when they're there, they're family. They're a part of this. They have that unconditional love that we have, that love that we just poured on each other that we got from my grandfather. Now, some of you may have had a family like that. You may have think, oh, yeah, I can remember back, the same kind of thing, small town. We all got together. We hung out together. It was great. But some people would say, hey, man, you don't even know my family. Don't even go there. So we won't. But we'll talk about other things that could be a family in another way, like high school buddies or high school girls that hung out together, spent a lot of time together. You were like best friends, and everything was great, and you didn't have to walk on eggshells around them, or you didn't have to watch what you said, or worried about what they thought of you. It wasn't all this facade that you put up. It was just you and them, and it was fun, and they were together, and you were together. Or you could have gone to college and been involved in a sorority or a fraternity, and you got your brothers or your sisters, and it was all one big family, and everybody loved each other, and there was no problems, and it was just fun, and you could just relax and not worry about the rest of the things. And it was special. It was nice to have those. I remember when I got one of my jobs, I was 23 years old, and everybody just about that worked there was between 23 and 25. We had the same purpose. We all had the same job. We all wanted to do the same thing. We all wanted to make it really good. We hung out together. We spent time outside of work and during work. We were like one big family. We loved each other. We did whatever we could for each other. We listened to each other. We cried with each other. We complained with each other, but we were together. It was great. We knew that each one of us loved each other a lot. And so it could have been anything in your life where you had that kind of tight-knit thing. Could have been a swim team or bowling, well, probably not bowling, but some place where you had a tight-knit deal where you just felt just relaxed. And that's what the church is supposed to be. I mean, really, when we come here, there shouldn't be anything that we have to hide or way we have to act, or things we have to watch what we say, or be careful that someone's going to find out something about us that they shouldn't, because our love for each other should be unconditional. It should be a love that goes beyond all that stuff and goes right to a love that we care about people, we care about individuals, we care about each other. It's all about relationships. That's what it's about. My grandfather instilled in us that relationships were more important than anything else, that our relationships with each other were more important than anything that we as an individual could bring in. And relationships are important to the church too. And doesn't it bother you? Doesn't it just hurt when somebody ruins that? Now, it could be as simple as, your high school buddies are all there, and one of them, moves because their dad got a job out of town, and all of a sudden, the person that was kind of the guy who's the leader of our group leaves, and now things aren't the same. Or your sorority or your fraternity, the people graduate, and the freshman pledges that came in are like, whew, there's something, it's not right. It's not the same kind of feeling. Or somebody ruins it. Somebody comes in that doesn't understand what this whole family thing's about. They don't understand what this unity, how important it is. They come in and they start saying things or talking about people or doing things that just start dividing you, just start ruining the whole thing, making it bad. I mean, it can be just time, too, and size. Our family got bigger and bigger and bigger. And you know what? It doesn't feel exactly the same after 20 years. I mean, there's this tight-knit core of unity going on there all the time. But it's a little bit different. Grandpa's gone. And even though every year we meet, because he meant so much to us, and we meet and we're together as a family, it's not exactly the same. It just doesn't, like even my old church, we had a pastor there who was there for 20 years, and he built this tight bond between the people in our church. We loved each other. I mean, it was like 60 people when we got there, and over the next 15 years, it just grew and grew and grew, and I felt like I knew everybody. I could stand up and look out and go, I know that person, that person, that person. Oops, so-and-so's not here, because they usually sit right there. We were that close, that tight. Well, he left, and then all of a sudden, some of the people who may have had a problem with somebody who wouldn't say anything because he would take care of it, started talking. And all of a sudden, there started to be this little bit of disunity going on. Things weren't right. People were getting upset with each other, and it started to break apart. And then we hired a new senior pastor, and he came in. He was more worried about his agenda than he was worried about keeping these relationships close. And it started to get worse and worse, and it wasn't the same. It was like, oh, this is not how it's supposed to be. Not in a church, not in a family, not when a family matters so much. How can this happen? Why would we let that kind of thing come in? See, when family matters, unity matters. And when unity matters, individuals matter. See how that works? When family matters as a whole, and the unity of that family matters, we all matter individually. And that's what we're looking for, relationships like that, where I matter. I want to matter. But it also works in reverse. In order for family to matter, it has to matter more than me. In order for the family unity to matter, it's got to matter more than me. It's got to matter more than you. So we've been talking over the last few weeks about that, about the benefits of membership and how being a part of a family is important, and that it gives you commitment, and it's a great benefit to have a family, a spiritual family involved. As also we talked about community and how you can take that family and make it smaller and build those relationships in a smaller group that make them more important and even closer and more intimate. And we talked about how baptism connects you to that family. It's a way that you can be connected and attached to the family of God. In Philippians chapter 2, it says, "Do nothing out of selfish ambition or vain conceit, but in humility consider others better than yourselves. Each of you should not look at your own interests, but also look at the interest of others." And that's what makes this family together. And so this morning when we talk about communion, what communion brings is something a little different than the other three. Where the other three show the benefits that you have of being part of a spiritual family, communion actually asks something of you. Communion says, look, as an individual, in order to preserve the unity of the family, you have to respect that. You have to do that. It's up to us as individuals to preserve the family as a whole. I mean, the only way to preserve relationships is for me to have a relationship with someone else. If I do something to ruin that, it's my responsibility to fix that. And if family matters, then it matters more than me. It matters more than what I think. And we know that family matters to God. We've been talking about it for the last few weeks, how family really matters to God. So if it matters to him, it must matter to us. So this morning when we talk about communion, we're going to go to 1 Corinthians chapter 11. This is the famous communion passage that's in the New Testament. 1 Corinthians is right after Romans, right before 2 Corinthians, which makes it convenient. And it's a book in the Bible, but really a lot of the books in the Bible started out as letters. And so the Apostle Paul would go around and he would start churches, and then he'd check in on them. And he'd find out what was going on, or he'd go back to visit to see what was going on. And if he couldn't get there to visit, he would write them a letter. If he heard about things or he wanted to praise them or tell them things, he would write a letter. And so there are a lot of letters that are in the New Testament, which are letters from Paul to churches. Well, some of you may have heard that, the Bible is a love letter from God, and it is. But this letter to the Corinthians probably didn't seem quite like a love letter. Paul wanted to deal with things. Just like my grandfather had to deal with things that were wrong, that's what Paul was doing here. See, in the Corinthian church, there was some disunity going on. In fact, he says there are divisions among you, and I believe it. And he wants to explain to them in this part of his letter that the reason that there are divisions and problems in there is because of a little thing that turns out to be a big thing. And he's referring the whole thing to communion. So let's go to verse 20, and we'll see how this works. Verse 20, it says, when you come together, it is not the Lord's Supper you eat. So you have to imagine that, they didn't have, copy machines back then. So when they get a letter, someone would stand up and read it, like an elder or pastor of the church, and he would stand up and he would read to everyone. He'd say, when you come together, it is not the Lord's Supper you eat. Now, most of the people are sitting there going, oh, yes, it is, because we just had it last week, and it was the Lord's Supper. We ate together. It was the Lord's Supper. What he's saying is you are forgetting what the Lord's Supper means. See, the Lord's Supper was actually started back by Jesus himself. When he was with his disciples in the upper room, it was called the Last Supper. And at that time, he instituted something new, something that would help us to remember what he was about to do. Now, the disciples didn't get it right then, but Jesus started something then that we would remember forever. And so from that came communion. And communion is a periodical thing to help us remember that event and what would follow. And so the Lord's Supper was actually a supper. It started as a Passover meal, and that's what the disciples thought they were eating, was the Passover meal. The Passover was a meal that they would take in remembrance of the nation of Israel being freed as slaves from Egypt. And so once a year they'd get together and they'd have this Passover meal and remember that. Remember the freedom that we had. Well, Jesus was about to institute something brand new from that meal. And it was called the Lord's Supper. So in verse 21, Paul's continuing his letter. He says, for as you eat, each of you goes ahead without waiting for anybody else. One remains hungry, another one gets drunk. So what's Paul talking about here? What he's talking about is this supper that they were eating together. See, back then, the culture was that they would have these things called common meals. Basically, where a bunch of people would get together, they would all bring food and have a meal together. And it was real popular in the culture. And so people would do that. The only problem is that people who had a lot of money, who were rich, the upper class would come, and they'd bring all the good food and most of the food. And then the lower class people, ones who didn't have as much money, who would be considered poor, would come, and they didn't have the same amount of money or the same means to bring as the same amount of food or the same quality of food. And so they would have less. But in these common meals, it was really common for the upper class to go, you have to sit over there, and kind of divide the group and say, okay, all the lower class, you can come to the common meal, but you're over there. You have to eat over there. And it was really tough. It was not a fun place to be. Well, the church grabbed onto this and thought, you know what? We want to have a meal together, and we want it to be like a common meal, but we're going to do it differently. We're going to call it a potluck dinner. No. They said, we're going to call it a love feast, but it's actually a potluck dinner. That's what we do today. It kept carrying on all the way to today. The potluck dinners where everybody brings food, we say, hey, we're all going to get together, the whole church, and everybody brings some food. And everybody's like, oh, that's great. What if everybody brings the exact same thing? And that's when they developed that system where you go by your last name. All A through D bring meat, all E through G bring vegetables, and everyone else bring dessert. And so that's why potluck dinners are so popular, because you get a lot of desserts. Well, back there, these love feasts, as they called them, were great, because what they did was they erased all that division. People were still wealthy in the church, and there were still poor people that came to church. But when they came, it didn't matter how much you brought or what the quality was. It was all together, and everyone ate together. So a lot of times, the people who were the poorest in town, that was their best meal of the week because they got to eat the quality and the amount of food that people, the richer people, ate all the time. So it was really great. It really brought the church together, and it was a great way to be unified and to say, look, we are all equal here. There is no rich or poor or tall or thin, or tall and thin don't go together. Tall or short or fat or thin, or from South Carolina or Ohio or another foreign country. Doesn't matter. We are all the same. We are all together. We are all unified. We are all equal. And that's how they shared the meal. Well, the Corinthians seem to have lost the love in their love feast. See, they started to let that idea of the world come in. People would get in there, the ones that were more wealthy or had more food, would get in there and they'd just eat. They didn't wait for everyone else. They didn't care whether or not somebody who didn't have as much got food. They just ate. You heard the term eat, drink, and get merry and be merry? That's what they did. They ate, and then they had nothing else to eat, so they got drunk, and then they got merry, and it was bringing a bunch of division into the church. All of a sudden, the very thing that these love feasts, this church was supposed to be, started dividing everyone. It was doing just the opposite of what it should do. You say, oh, come on, that's just Joe. He always pigs out at these things. Or forget Fred, he doesn't understand. It was a big deal. It doesn't seem like a big deal. It's just food and a supper. Who cares? But it was a big deal because every time a little thing comes in that causes division, it causes division. And every time something really small that doesn't mean anything causes disunity, it causes disunity. And things just pile upon themselves, and if no one deals with it, it gets worse and worse and worse. And Paul wasn't about to let that happen. So, he let them have it. He wasn't going to let some selfish individuals ruin what the church was supposed to be. So, in verse 22, he says, "Don't you have homes to eat and drink in? Or do you despise the church of God and humiliate those who have nothing? What shall I say to you? Shall I praise you for this? Certainly not." Now, he was mad because, I don't know about you guys, but when my mom yelled at me and she yelled at me with questions, "Who do you think you are? Have you lost your mind?" I knew she was really mad because she couldn't think of anything else to say. So she was just, "Rah!" And that's the way Paul seems in this letter. He is upset about this little dinner, but he's upset because it's causing problems in the church, things that shouldn't happen. It's like he wanted this to be a serious thing because in their selfishness, they were forgetting what was important. They were forgetting the importance of this meal that Jesus had laid out for them, this Lord's Supper, this communion meal. They had forgot the importance of that. So Paul takes time now to explain to them, hey, remember what this is all about. Verse 23 says, "For I received from the Lord what I also passed on to you." This is not a joke. This is not something I'm making up. This is something that I got from the Lord and I'm passing on to you. This is important stuff. The Lord Jesus, on the night he was betrayed, this is the Last Supper, referring back to that night, took bread, and when he had given thanks, he broke it and said, "This is my body, which is for you. Do this in remembrance of me." Now, obviously, this wasn't his real body. He was sitting right there. But he held up this bread and he broke it. And he said, "This is my body, which is for you." The disciples were probably thinking, what is he talking about? Do this in remembrance of me, which made it even worse because a remembrance was like a memorial. And the only time you had to have a memorial was when someone was dead. What Jesus was saying was, tomorrow I am going to die, and my body is going to be broken. And what I'm about to do is going to change everything. And I never want you to forget that. So I want you to start to do this. Every time you take that piece of bread and you break it, I want you to remember what it's for and why we take it. In the same way, after supper, he took the cup, saying, "This cup is the new covenant in my blood. Do this whenever you drink it in remembrance of me. And so he took a cup of wine and he said the same thing. And he said, this cup is the new covenant in my blood. Now the disciples may be thinking, new covenant? I didn't even know there was an old covenant. What's the new covenant? Well, there was an old covenant. And the old covenant, a covenant is just like an agreement between two people. So God made an agreement with the nation of Israel. And he said, you follow these laws and I will bless you. You do something and I will do something. Just like our modern day contract. I do something and someone else does something because of that contract. And that's what the law was. That was the old covenant. That's the way it worked. And part of that was that you sacrificed animals. You shed the blood of animals in order to have atonement for your sins or forgiveness of sins. So periodically they would do that. And so God would forgive sins because of that shedding of blood. Well, Jesus was going to change that whole thing, something brand new. This is the new covenant. Now, covenant can also be where an agreement where somebody does something for someone else and the other person just gets it. It's kind of like a will. You know, it's like your Uncle Charlie dies and he says, for you, Jimmy, I leave to you my house, my car, $20,000, and my Elvis commemorative stamp collection. You get that. You didn't have to do anything for it. Uncle Charlie's given it to you. And just like that, Jesus is about to do the same thing. This is a new covenant. There was an agreement between him and the people. He was about to do something, and everyone would benefit from it. What he was going to do was he was going to die, and blood was a part of it. There was going to be one shedding of blood. There was going to be one sacrifice, one atonement for sins, one time for everyone. But unlike Uncle Charlie's gift, what Jesus was offering was a guilt-free, sin-free relationship with God himself. That's how important it is. It's not just a relationship between people. This is a relationship with God. This is the ultimate relationship that he was offering, something that would not only last until the next sacrifice, but it was done. It would last forever. And it didn't matter how rich or poor or tall or short, whether you were a Greek or a Jew, everyone was equal because of that. Because of the shedding of blood that Jesus was about to do the next day, everyone would be equal. That's what communion was all about. That was serious stuff. And Paul wanted to make sure that these Corinthians remembered that they understood that. Jesus wanted to preserve what this was all about by having something that you would do together, come together as a family to do, so that you would remember how important it was. Serious stuff. I mean, something's got to be serious, right? It all can't be fun and games. Sometime we have to just stop and go, why are we here? What are we doing? Are we messing things up? Well, remember what happened. Think back. God was smart. He put this in place so we would never forget. And look, it's still happening today over 2,000 years. We still celebrate communion, and we do it for the very reason of remembering what Christ did for us. So he says in verse 26, For whenever you eat this bread and drink this cup, you proclaim the Lord's death until he comes. He's saying when you take communion, then you represent Christ in the church. That unity, that specialness, the relationships that are in the church, you're a representative of that. He says proclaim it. That's like standing up and preaching. How would you like to come up here every time you took communion and preached it? But that's what you're doing. Every time you take communion, you are proclaiming Christ's death until he comes. That not only what he did, but what he's about to do, what he's going to do. And we do that in a serious way. It's a serious thing. And Paul wants us to make sure that we remember that it's not just something that we should do without thinking through it. And it's not something that we should do bringing in baggage of bad relationships or bad things that are going on between us in the church. As individuals, it's our responsibility to deal with those kind of things. And communion helps us to remember that. Verse 27, it says, Therefore, whoever eats the bread and drinks the cup of the Lord in an unworthy manner will be guilty of sinning against the body and the blood of the Lord. By not taking it seriously, you're disgracing what Christ meant, what the church church means. A man ought to examine himself before he eats of the bread and drinks of the cup. This isn't judging each other. This isn't looking to the guy next to you and thinking, oh, I wonder what he did, or oh, I heard he did this, or, I can't believe that she did that to me. This is looking at yourself. What can I do? What can I do to preserve that unity? Am I doing anything? Is there anything in my life or my heart that's causing a problem? This is God's way of being my grandfather and getting in your face and saying, you got to fix something. There's something wrong. But he does it where we do it to ourselves as individuals internally. Communion's a reminder of that. That's what it is. It's to help us remember. Like my grandfather instituted that family picnic. Communion was instituted by God so that we would never forget. Verse 29, for anyone who eats and drinks without recognizing the body of the Lord eats and drinks judgment on himself. That's why many among you are weak and sick, and a number of you have fallen asleep. But if we judge ourselves, we would not come under judgment. This is a judgment of a father to his son, of a grandfather to his grandson. God to us, because of that relationship, he treats us like his kids. He wants us to do right because he loves us so much. And he loves this church, and it matters to him. Family matters so much that he instituted this so that we take care of business, so that we can take care of business with each other. When we are judged by the Lord, we are being disciplined so that we will not be condemned with the world. He doesn't want the church to be like the world. He wants this to be a place that's safe, that's comfortable, where we can come in and not have to worry about the things that are out there, the anger and the meanness and the self-centeredness. It's a place that's different. So then, my brothers, when you come together to eat, wait for each other. God wants us to preserve what's most important: relationships. Relationships with each other. The relationships with each other here, which are different than relationships out there, where there's no backstabbing, where there's no talking behind people's back, where gossip's not involved, where people love each other unconditionally, no matter what. He wants us to preserve those. Relationships matter to God. The church family matters to God. It matters so much that he would take something simple and just dumb, like a potluck dinner gone bad, and he would make a point of it. He would point it out and say, look, even this little thing is a big deal when it comes to breaking that unity that the church is supposed to be. Hey, we all want something that's different. That's why we come to church. I mean, really, I've never known anybody who said, I have all the money I need, I have the greatest job, I have all the stuff I want, my family is great, all my relationships are great, my entire world is great, I think I'll go to church. No. We come here because what's out there isn't great. There's something missing. There's something not right. And this is where we find it right. And each of us has a responsibility to make sure it stays right. And communion is the best way for us to remember that. And that's why we do that. You see, if you want to be part of a family that matters, you have to do your part. For a family to matter, family has to matter more than me. For a family to really matter, it has to matter more than you. Let's pray.